So if you look up Cptsd online, sometimes you see stuff saying it's not in the DSM because it's too similar to borderline personality disorder. That's actually not true. I think it's because insurances don't want to pay for it because it can take a long time of treatment. But let me talk about the differences between the two disorders. First of all, the two have completely different symptoms. Somebody with BPD does not necessarily have flashbacks, nightmares, and does not necessarily go to long extents to avoid certain things that remind them of trauma, while people with Cptsd do not necessarily go through frantic efforts to avoid abandonment or do not necessarily have the same type of fear of abandonment. They don't necessarily have an unstable identity, and their emotional regulation skills are not necessarily as bad as somebody with BPD. Another big difference I don't see talked about enough is in order to have a personality disorder in general, you have to lack object constancy and whole object relations. So people with BPD or personality disorder might do this thing called splitting, where when they're mad at somebody, they only see that person's negative traits and cannot remember any positive traits that person has, and vice versa. When they're idolizing somebody or in love with somebody, they might not see the negative traits that person has. They also might have trouble remembering how somebody made them feel when the person's not presently in front of them. They might have trouble remembering how they felt in the past because they can only think in present terms. My personal opinion is that BPD is a response to trauma, same with all personality disorders. I know some studies say otherwise, but I think those studies are ignoring the fact that not everybody with BPD might realize that they were emotionally neglected or emotionally abused, or the studies might not be taking certain things as trauma, such as a parent being absent during certain ages. However, that does not necessarily mean that everybody with BPD necessarily has PTSD. You can go through trauma and have certain reactions to it without developing PTSD. It's kind of similar to how somebody can have a disorder, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a disability, because having a disorder does not necessarily mean that you are disabled from it and cannot work. As somebody with Cptsd, one difference I've noticed is a lot of people with BPD who I've spoken to, their mood retains quite often. My mood doesn't change all that often throughout the day. If something triggers my PTSD, it might make me anxious and make me remember my trauma, but on an hourly basis, my mood stays for the most part pretty stable. I have major depressive disorder, and obviously sometimes I get anxious and stuff, but my mood swings are not quite as frantic as I've heard people with BPD describe them. I also have a good sense of who I am as a person. I might be very insecure with who I am due to psychological abuse, but I don't think I have an unstable sense of identity. And I've also spoken to many therapists in the past and asked them if they think I have a personality disorder, and all of them have said no. At the end of the day,